The sun-drenched silence of the Morning Star bookstore was a piece Kang Hyun-Woo had bought with blood, and for 3 years the currency had held. In the sleepy coastal town where they now lived, he was simply Mr. Kang, the quiet man who could fix a broken spine on a first-edition Hemingway with the same steady precision he once used to dismantle rivals. He spent his mornings shelving poetry and his afternoons waiting at the school gates, a soft cardigan draped over shoulders that had once worn bulletproof silk. Across the room, the bell above the door chimed, but Hyun-Woo didn't look up from the pop-up book he was mending for Zuri's second-grade class. He was a paper surgeon now, his scarred knuckles moving gently to align a cardboard dragon's wing. He was happy, he was invisible. But 6,000 miles away, in a windowless high-rise overlooking the neon sprawl of Seoul, invisibility was being stripped away 1 pixel at a time. The room smelled of stale ozone and expensive cigarettes. A single computer monitor cut through the gloom, casting a harsh blue light over the face of a man who had spent 3 years nursing a grudge in the shadow of a fallen empire. On the screen, a shaky smartphone video from a primary school talent show was playing. It was a heartwarming clip that had amassed 4 million views in 48 hours, a hidden gem of a father and daughter playing a piano duet. The man in the chair leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as the camera zoomed in on the father's profile. He saw the way the man on the screen tilted his head, the specific, lethal grace in his posture that even a knit sweater couldn't hide. He saw the jagged scar across the knuckles as they danced over the ivory keys. A pale, trembling finger reached out and clicked pause. The image froze on Hyun-Woo's face, a half-smile caught in the glow of a school stage light. It was the face of a man who thought he had escaped. "Found you," the man whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He picked up a phone, the light reflecting off a ring bearing the crest of the Choi Syndicate. "Assemble the team. The Ice King didn't die, he just went to sleep. It's time to wake him up." Back in the bookstore, the air suddenly felt thin. Hyun-Woo's hand faltered, the cardboard wing of the dragon tearing slightly under the sudden pressure of his thumb. He didn't know why, but the phantom ache in his side, where the bullet had scarred him years ago, began to throb. He looked toward the window, his eyes scanning the quiet street, the instinct of a predator sensing a distant, approaching storm. The dragon wasn't dead. The world had simply reminded it how to breathe fire. The morning air in the bookstore was thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering sweetness of the pancakes Awa had made before leaving for her shift at the clinic. Hyun-Woo was in the back, meticulously organizing a shipment of vintage maps, when the bell above the door gave a solitary, mournful chime. He didn't hear footsteps, only the soft thump of something being placed on the polished oak of the front counter. By the time he stepped out from the stacks, the shop was empty. The street outside was a blur of morning fog and passing cyclists, none of whom looked out of place. But there, sitting atop a stack of Steinbeck novels, was a delivery that didn't belong. It was a single black lily. The petals were velvet dark, almost obsidian, and so fresh that beads of dew still clung to the stem like cold sweat. There was no vase, no colorful wrapping, and most importantly, no note. In the language of the world Hyun-Woo had left behind, a message didn't need words when it carried the scent of a funeral. Hyun-Woo stood frozen, the warmth of his morning coffee suddenly turning to ash in his throat. To any other customer, it would have been an exotic, if somewhat somber, floral arrangement. To him, it was a calling card. The black lily was the signature of the Choi Syndicate's inner circle, a flower that bloomed only in the shadows of the graveyard. He reached out, his scarred knuckles brushing the delicate petal. He had spent 3 years building a fortress of normalcy, convincing himself that the Ice King was a ghost trapped in a different hemisphere. He had changed his name, his country, and his soul. But as the floral scent filled the small shop, the walls of his sanctuary felt as thin as parchment. The ice was beginning to melt. He didn't call the police. He knew they couldn't stop what was coming. Instead, he walked to the front door and flipped the sign from open to closed. He moved with a sudden, lethal efficiency that had been dormant for far too long, his eyes scanning the rooftops across the street with the practiced gaze of a sniper. He retreated to the back of the store, locking the heavy deadbolt with a final metallic click. The cardigan he wore suddenly felt like a ridiculous disguise, a costume for a man who no longer existed. He looked at his hands that had mended books and tucked Zuri into bed, and felt the phantom weight of a firearm returning to his grip. They had found the bookstore. They had found his peace. And by sending the lily, they weren't just threatening him, they were telling him that the time for hiding was over. The dragon had been tracked to its lair, and the scent of death was already through the door. The fog rolling off the coast usually brought a sense of calm to the town, but today it felt like a shroud. Hyun-Woo stood by the window of the bookstore, his eyes fixed on the corner where a WAS bus always dropped her off at 5:15 p.m. The clock on the wall ticked with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a closing tomb. 5:30 p.m., then 6:00 p.m. The silence in the shop grew deafening. Zuri was in the back room, humming a song as she colored, blissfully unaware that the air had turned to static. Hyun-Woo didn't wait for a phone call. He knew the choreography of the underworld too well. They didn't call to negotiate until they had already drawn blood. He stepped out into the damp evening, his stride lengthening into the predatory gait he had spent years trying to unlearn. He headed toward the clinic, retracing the 3-block path Awa walked every day. Halfway there, in a narrow alleyway that served as a shortcut between the main road and their street, he found the snatched shadow. The scene was clinical in its brevity. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic footprints in the mud, only the chilling efficiency of professionals. Lying in the center of the pavement was a WAS stethoscope. The polished metal chest piece, which had spent the day listening to the heartbeats of the living, was now shattered. A heavy, lugged combat boot had ground it into the asphalt, leaving a jagged tread mark across the tubing. Hyun-Woo knelt, his fingers hovering over the wreckage. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. The warmth he had cultivated over the last 3 years vanished, replaced by an absolute sub-zero vacuum. The paper surgeon was gone. The man who mended dragons was dead. He picked up the broken instrument, the cold steel biting into his scarred palm. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a desecration of the life they had built. By crushing the tool of her new profession, the Choi Syndicate was telling him that Awa's future was over and his past had finally caught up. A low vibration hummed in his pocket. He pulled out the burner phone, the one that hadn't breathed in 1,000 days. The screen glowed with an unfamiliar number from a Seoul area code. He answered, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. "She has a very steady pulse, Hyun-Woo," a voice rasped from the other side, punctuated by the distant, muffled sound of a struggle. "But you know how quickly a heart can stop when it's broken." Hyun-Woo gripped the phone so hard the casing groaned. He looked back toward the bookstore where Zuri was waiting, then down at the crushed stethoscope. The Ice King was back, and this time he wouldn't stop until the streets of Seoul ran as black as the lily they had sent him. The bookstore smelled of dust and cedar, a scent that had come to mean safety, but as Hyun-Woo moved toward the back storage room, the air felt thick with the sulfur of a forgotten life. He knelt on the floor, pushing aside a heavy rug and a stack of overstocked biographies. With a crowbar he hadn't touched in years, he pried up the floorboards. The wood groaned and splintered, a visceral protest against the exhaling of a secret better left buried. Buried beneath the foundation was a literal chest, made of reinforced steel and sealed with a biometric lock that recognized a thumbprint the world thought had been erased. When the lid hissed open, it didn't reveal gold or jewels. It revealed the cold, matte-black geometry of the Ice King's true inheritance. Hyun-Woo reached in, his fingers brushing against the heavy weights of custom-loaded magazines and the sleek, lethal curves of a suppressed handgun. The metal felt wrong against his skin, too heavy, too cold, yet his muscles remembered the weight with a terrifying, instinctive muscle memory. He began the ritual, his movements becoming a blur of mechanical efficiency. He checked the slide, cleared the chamber, and felt the familiar click of a magazine locking into place. It was the sound of a door closing on the man who fixed books. "Daddy!" The voice was a tiny splinter of light in the darkness. Hyun-Woo froze, the handgun halfway to the holster at his small of his back. He turned slowly to see Zuri standing in the doorway, her shadow long and thin against the bookshelves. She was holding her tattered stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide as she stared at the man she didn't recognize. In that moment, the gentle daddy who baked cookies and read bedtime stories was a ghost. Standing before her was a man with eyes like flint, dressed in a tactical jacket that made him look broader, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. The contrast was a jagged tear in the fabric of her world, the soft cardboard of her pop-up books replaced by the hard, unforgiving steel in his hands. "Are we playing a game?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Hyun-Woo looked at her, and for a second, the mask of the Ice King cracked. He wanted to go to her, to tell her that everything was fine, but the blood on the floorboards of his memory wouldn't let him. He tucked the weapon into his holster, the leather creaking softly in the silence. "No, Zuri," he said, his voice a low, vibrating frequency that sounded like a command. "We're going on a trip. I need to go find Mommy, and I need you to be very, very brave." He stood up, the shadow of the warrior stretching over the room, eclipsing the bookstore manager forever. He wasn't just a father anymore, he was a guardian who had just remembered how to kill. As he reached out his hand to her, Zuri took it, but she didn't smile. She looked at his belt, at the hidden death he carried, and realized that her dragon had finally woken up. The air in Incheon International Airport was thick with the scent of jet fuel and sea salt, a cold welcome for a man who had been dead to the world for 3 years. Hyun-Woo stepped through the sliding glass doors, but he didn't look like a tourist or a returning businessman. He wore the silence of a grave and the focus of a bullet. The soft cardigan was gone, replaced by a dark, high-collared coat that cut a sharp silhouette against the neon smear of the Seoul skyline. He wasn't a ghost anymore, he was a hurricane making landfall. He didn't check into a hotel. He went straight to the Iron District, a labyrinth of interconnected alleys and underground bars where the city's secrets were traded like currency. His first stop was a basement club called the Gilded Cage, a place he had once owned in a life that felt like a fever dream. As he pushed open the heavy steel doors, the rhythmic thud of the bass faltered. It started at the bar and rippled through the room like a cold front, a sudden, suffocating silence. Men who had been laughing a moment ago choked on their drinks. The Ice King was standing in the doorway, the blue light of the club reflecting off eyes that held no mercy. He walked through the center of the room, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. He didn't have to draw a weapon, his presence was its own threat. He reached the booth where a mid-level lieutenant was holding court. The man looked up, his face draining of color until he was as pale as the silk shirt he wore. "Hyun-Woo," the lieutenant whispered, his voice cracking. You're supposed to be Ash." Hyun-Woo didn't answer with words. He reached out, his scarred hand grabbing the man's tie and slamming his head onto the table with a dull, sickening thud. He leaned in close, his voice a low, vibrating frequency that cut through the dying music. "I am the fire that survived the ash," Hyun-Woo said. "Tell Jin-ho that the price for touching my wife just went up. I don't want a negotiation, I want a war." He stood up, leaving the man trembling amidst shattered glass. As he walked out, he could hear the frantic clatter of phones being dialed, the whispers of "he's back" spreading through the city like a virus. The underworld was turning cold, the realization dawning on them that the monster they had provoked wasn't the man from the piano video. It was the man who had built their world, and now he was here to burn it down. The meeting took place in the skeletal remains of an unfinished skyscraper, a jagged spine of steel and concrete that overlooked the Han River. The wind howled through the open girders, carrying the scent of rain and industrial exhaust. Jin-ho stood at the edge of the precipice, his tailored suit fluttering like the wings of a crow. He didn't look like a mobster, he looked like a banker who had just closed the deal of a lifetime. Hyun-Woo stepped out of the shadows of a support pillar, his hands empty, his coat unbuttoned. He didn't look at the 3 snipers, whose red laser sights danced across his chest like blood-red fireflies. He looked only at the man who had dared to break the peace. "You've grown old, Hyun-Woo," Jin-ho said, turning with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The bookstore suits you, it's a quiet place to wait for death." "The books were for my daughter," Hyun-Woo replied, his voice as flat and cold as the river below. This is for you." Jin-ho laughed, a sharp, dry sound. He pulled a tablet from his pocket and tapped the screen. A graining security feed flickered to life, showing Awa tied to a chair in a room of windowless concrete. She was bruised, her breathing shallow, but her eyes were fixed on the camera with a defiance that made Hyun-Woo's heart ache. "Let's skip the theatrics," Jin-ho said, his tone turning businesslike. "We both know why you're here. The Iron Ledger, the digital keys to the offshore billions your predecessor squirreled away before you retired. My brother died trying to find them. I don't intend to follow him to the grave empty-handed." "The ledger was encrypted with a biometric lock that dies with the holder," Hyun-Woo said. "You know that. That's why you need me alive." "Exactly. The demand is simple. Give me the billions, and the woman lives. You have 24 hours to transfer the funds to the accounts I've provided. If the numbers don't move, her heart stops moving. And then, I'll come for the little girl in the bookstore." Hyun-Woo didn't flinch at the threat to Zuri. Instead, a terrifying stillness settled over him. He had spent years trying to erase the ledger from his mind, treating it like a cursed relic of a dead man. But as he looked at Awa's face on the small screen, he realized that the money wasn't a burden anymore. It was a weapon. "You want the money, Jin-ho? Fine," Hyun-Woo whispered, stepping closer until the red dots of the snipers converged on his forehead. "But remember this, once I give it to you, I have no reason to keep you alive. You aren't buying a fortune, you're buying the end of your life." Jin-ho's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the cold certainty in Hyun-Woo's eyes cutting through his arrogance. He stepped back into his waiting car, the door slamming with a finality that echoed through the empty steel. Hyun-Woo stood alone on the heights, the ledger's secret burning in his mind like white-hot coal. The trade was set, but Jin-ho had forgotten one thing. A man who has lost everything is dangerous, but a man who has found everything and is about to lose it again is a god of ruin. The basement of the high-rise was a tomb of damp concrete and humming electrical transformers, vibrating with the pulse of a city Awa had once cleaned but never truly belonged to. Her wrists were raw from the zip ties, and the copper taste of a split lip lingered in her mouth, but her mind was as sharp as a surgical needle. For years, she had survived by being the woman no one noticed, the shadow in the corner with a mop and a bucket, and she knew that the greatest weakness of powerful men was their inability to see the help. Her captors, two young soldiers of the Syndicate, who spent more time checking their reflections in the polished elevator doors than watching her, paced the perimeter of the room. They saw a broken cleaner. They didn't see a woman who had memorized the structural weaknesses of every building she had ever serviced. "I need to go to the bathroom," Awa rasped, her voice cracking with a calculated fragility. The guard with the bleached hair scoffed, but the heavy humidity of the basement was making him restless. He yanked her up, cutting the ties on her feet but keeping her hands bound, and shoved her toward a small, grime-streaked utility closet used by the janitorial staff. Inside, the scent of industrial bleach and pine oil hit her like a memory of home. She had less than a minute. With her hands still bound in front of her, she didn't reach for the door. Instead, she reached into the hollowed-out base of a heavy-duty floor buffer she knew was a standard model for this developer. Hidden behind the motor housing was a loose panel. She didn't find a gun, but she found something better for a woman who knew how to disappear. A heavy, serrated glass cutter and a small canister of pressurized degreaser. She didn't use the tool to escape. She used it to weaken the hinges of the heavy steel door from the inside, an invisible fracture that would cause the metal to buckle under the slightest external pressure. Then, she tucked the glass cutter into the waistband of her skirt, hiding it beneath the fold of her torn blouse. When she stepped back out, her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped in a perfect imitation of defeat. The guards didn't even bother to search her. To them, she was just a distraction in a skirt. They didn't notice the subtle hiss of the degreaser she had sprayed on the soles of their boots as she brushed past the utility rack. Awa sat back down in the wooden chair, her heart drumming a steady, wartime rhythm. She had turned their fortress into a slide, and her invisibility had provided her with a blade. She looked up at the flickering fluorescent light, a small, cold smile touching her lips. Hyun-Woo was coming, she knew that, but she had no intention of waiting to be rescued. The Ice King's wife was tired of being a shadow. It was time to become the blade. The silence of the bookstore was no longer peaceful, it was hollow. Zuri sat on the floor of the back office, the colorful rugs and fairy tale books feeling like relics of a world that had vanished overnight. Outside, a dark-suited man stood by the entrance, one of the uncles her father had called to watch over her. He was kind, but his eyes never stopped moving, and he wore his jacket even in the heat, hiding the heavy shape at his hip. Restless and aching for the sound of her father's voice, Zuri began to tug at a loose floorboard near the desk, hoping to find a hidden toy or a forgotten sweet. Instead, her fingers brushed against a weathered envelope tucked into a velvet-lined crevice. The paper was thick and cream-colored, smelling faintly of the expensive ink her father used for special occasions. Her name was written on the front in his elegant, sweeping script. She opened it slowly, her heart thumping against her ribs. "My dearest Zuri," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means the sun has gone down on our quiet life, and the shadows have found us. I have spent every day of your life trying to bury the man I used to be, hoping you would only ever know the father who mends your books and teaches you the piano. But the world is not as kind as the stories we read together." Zuri's breath hitched as she traced the words. The ink seemed to shimmer under the dim lamp. "There is a part of me that belongs to the cold. I call it the Ice King, a monster I created to survive a land without mercy. I promised myself I would never let you see him, but if you find this, it means I have had to wake him up. I have had to become the monster again to keep you and your mother safe. Do not be afraid of the man the world sees now. Know that every shadow I walk through and every fire I light is only to ensure that you can keep living in the light. You are my heart, Zuri. Everything else is just ice." A single tear hit the page, blurring the word monster. Zuri looked up at the doorway, seeing the shadow of the guard against the frosted glass. She remembered the hard, flinty look in her father's eyes before he left, the way his hands had moved with lethal grace over the steel in the chest. She understood now. He wasn't a hero from a book. He was something much more terrifying and much more devoted. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, right next to her heart. She wasn't a little girl waiting for a bookstore manager anymore. She was the daughter of the Ice King, and she would be as brave as the man who was currently burning the world down to find his way back to her. The rain over Seoul was a deluge of silver needles, drumming a frantic war beat against the glass skeleton of the Iron Peak headquarters. To the guards patrolling the marble lobby, the building was a fortress of state-of-the-art biometrics and heavy steel. To Hyun-Woo, it was a body he knew every vein of, not because he had sat on its throne, but because he had listened to a wah. He didn't approach the front gates. Instead, he dropped into the darkness of a rain-slicked service alley 3 blocks away. He found the rusted grate tucked behind a dumpster, the exact blind spot Awa had once described when she complained about the faulty drainage near the basement lockers. He moved with a predatory silence, his dark coat damp and heavy, a shadow merging with the steam of the city's underbelly. Inside the service tunnels, the air smelled of wet concrete and industrial detergent. These were the veins of the building that the elite never saw, the narrow, claustrophobic crawl spaces where the invisibles moved. Hyun-Woo navigated the maze with a map drawn from Awa's memory. He bypassed the infrared sensors of the main stairwell by climbing a ventilation shaft she had once mentioned was always left unlocked for the night cleaning crew. The siege was not a loud affair of grenades and gunfire. It was a surgical strike. Every time a guard appeared in the dim yellow light of a service corridor, Hyun-Woo was already behind them. He moved like a ghost reclaimed from the ether, his strikes precise and silent, leaving unconscious men in his wake like discarded husks. He wasn't fighting for territory or the billions in the ledger. He was moving toward the heart of the building with the singular focus of a man reclaiming his soul. He reached the heavy maintenance door leading to the sub-basement transformers. The handle was slick with the degreaser Awa had strategically sprayed, just as she had planned. He felt the familiar vibration of the building's power grid beneath his boots. Somewhere above him, Jinho was waiting for a transfer of wealth, but Hyun-Woo was already inside the wire. He checked his suppressed handgun one last time, the click of the slides swallowed by the hum of the machinery. He wasn't the king returning to his palace. He was a storm that had crawled through the mud to reach the light. As he kicked open the final service door, the Ice King vanished, and the husband took his place, his eyes locking onto the concrete room where Awa sat waiting. The rescue had begun, and the Iron Peak was about to learn that its walls were only as strong as the people it tried to keep out. The air in the sub-basement was a tomb of cold ozone and the smell of impending ruin. Jin-ho stood behind the heavy concrete pillar, his hand gripping Awa's shoulder, a jagged piece of glass held trembling against her throat. He looked at the tablet in Hyun-Woo's hand as if it were a holy relic, his eyes wide with a frantic, starving greed. "The transfer, Hyun-Woo, do it now, or the last thing you see is her blood on this floor," Jin-ho screamed, his voice cracking against the hum of the transformers. Hyun-Woo stood 10 feet away, his silhouette framed by the red emergency lights. He didn't raise his weapon. He held the tablet up, the screen glowing with a complex array of scrolling code, the iron ledger, the digital keys to $10 billion and 100 shattered lives. It was the weight of his past, the anchor that had kept him chained to the darkness for decades. "You think this money is power, Jin-ho?" Hyun-Woo's voice was a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. "It is. It's a curse. It's the reason my daughter had to find a letter explaining why her father is a monster. It's the reason the woman I love is bleeding." "I don't care about your philosophy," Jin-ho barked, pressing the glass closer. "Give me the code." Awa's eyes met Hyun-Woo's. In that silent exchange, there was no fear, only a fierce, wordless command. She had already weakened the hinges of the door behind them. She had already fought her own war. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was asking to be free. Hyun-Woo's thumb hovered over the screen. "You want the Empire? Watch it burn." With a single, deliberate swipe, he didn't initiate a transfer. He activated the zero-sum protocol, a self-destruct sequence he had written years ago for a day he hoped would never come. On the screen, the billions didn't move to a new account. They simply ceased to exist. The offshore accounts were purged, the encrypted servers in Switzerland were wiped to white noise, and the Iron Ledger became nothing more than a collection of dead pixels. "No," Jin-ho shrieked, his face contorting into a mask of pure agony. For a split second, the greed paralyzed him. That second was all Awa needed. She slammed her weight back, the weakened door behind them buckling just enough to throw Jin-ho off balance. As he stumbled, Hyun-Woo moved with the speed of a winter gale. He didn't fire a bullet. He used the heavy tablet, the useless piece of plastic that had just cost $10 billion, to strike Jin-ho across the temple. The syndicate leader fell like a puppet with cut strings, the glass shard clattering uselessly onto the concrete. Hyun-Woo didn't look at the fallen man. He dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he pulled Awa into his arms. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, the scent of her skin finally replacing the smell of ozone. The fortune was gone. The empire was ash. And as he held her in the dim, red light of the basement, Kang Hyun-Woo realized he had never been richer. He had chosen the heartbeat over the gold, and for the first time in his life, the Ice King was warm. The salt air of the Mediterranean was a balm, a world away from the neon shadows of Seoul. On a secluded, sun-bleached pier, the family stood together. The horizon a vast expanse of gold and blue. Awa leaned her head against Hyun-Woo's shoulder, her hand interlaced with his, no longer a protector and a shadow, but two halves of a whole. Hyun-Woo pulled the burner phone from his pocket. It was the last tether to the Iron Ledger, the last witness to the Ice King's reign. With a flick of his wrist, the device arched through the air, a small black stone sinking into the depths of the sea. The past vanished with a quiet splash. Zuri, clutching a handful of seashells, looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "The bad men are gone now," she whispered. "Are you still a dragon, Daddy?" Hyun-Woo knelt, pulling her into a fierce embrace. The hardness in his gaze had finally melted, replaced by a light that no syndicate could extinguish. He smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression that reached his eyes. "No, Zuri," he breathed, "just a father." If you've followed this journey from the shadows of the syndicate to this final, hard-won piece, let us know your favorite moment in the comments. Would you have sacrificed a billion-dollar empire for love? Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss our next cinematic saga.